everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We wanted to do a little bit of a different kind of session than people are typically used to. We run a lot of different programs here. Well, HTDC does. I'm just a dude, don't work for HTDC. But HTDC runs a lot of different programs, a lot of different workshops. And one of the things that people often run into when they're trying to figure out, well, how do I take the next step for my business is, of course, money. Everybody needs money. Green is the color of business, whether we like it or not. So today we actually have a little bit of a combined session. I'm going to take roughly around, well, at this point, 50 minutes or so, and just talk about some basics for things like budgeting for federal awards. Because putting together a budget for the federal government based off an award they give you, whether it's a grant, whether it's a contract, whether it's a procurement opportunity, can be tricky at best. And there are some things you can do that can actually come back to, frankly, bite you in the ass later on. So want to make sure you don't do that. And then after I get done, we're going to have Sarah Allen come in and talk about just some accounting principles, financing, also maybe a little bit about things like indirect rates, because knowing what your budget is important, but then also knowing how to actually account for that, knowing what to do, knowing how to track. Once you are operating under federal monies, the things you need to do, how you need to account for those monies, how you need to account for the spending, how you actually need to separate things out from your business and your personal life become very complex for a lot of people. And it becomes very overwhelming. And then after Sarah gets done, we're going to have a representative from the state actually talk about one of the, well, if you're working in SBIR and STTR, one of the things that you should know about and should be applying for as soon as it's available is the state's R&D tax credit. The state of Hawaii does have a research and development tax credit. I would give a brief overview about it, but I'm going to let the person that knows about it talk about it so that I don't say anything that the state goes, that's wrong, don't say that. But if it operates like other tax credits that other states use, it's a really great way to kind of offset your tax obligation and get some incentives back if you're working in a very high impact, a highly economic relevant and economic focused impact area. But it's a lot of startup, and I'm going to have to pay attention to the chat every now and then just to make sure. But we will go ahead and get started with the first part here, which again is budgeting for federal awards. And really, it's just about navigating costs, cost categories, and knowing things about items such as allowables that you have. Did this thing literally die on me? Whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll worry about that later. Okay. So what do you need to know about federal award budgets? Well, there's a couple of things that actually everybody should be aware of and everybody should understand. When you get an award from the federal government, there are several types of federal funding that you might actually be able or be operating under. And it really matters on what the award type is. There's typical things such as procurement awards, grants, contracts, but it really is dependent on who was the awarding agency, what do they want done, and what do you as an awardee look like. You can have awards whether you're a for-profit business, you can have an award whether you're a nonprofit business, you can have an award whether you're in what's called an NGO, a non-governmental organization. There's a bunch of different ways that the federal government wants to give money to others to actually operate. And typically it's operating under a mission that they want you to do, something that they want to happen, something that they want to actually be able to impact, something that they actually want to drive forward, that they go, we ain't going to be the ones to do it. We want somebody else to, because it's going to take a lot less money and a lot less effort if you actually do it for us. So generally, when you're a nonprofit, there are two types of, let's just call them vehicles. It's either a grant or a cooperative agreement. Not a lot you need to know about either of these, at least for our purposes, but really quick, high level, a grant is a best effort. You state, we are going to do this thing. And the federal government, or you can actually get grants from state governments, local governments, foundations. Doesn't really matter who's giving you the grant. All a grant says, though, is we want to help do something. We really want to focus on growing the economy, growing workforce development, growing jobs, growing something. It's really a growth metric, and it is a best effort scenario. You're pushing forward, you're doing things. If it doesn't work out, no harm, no foul. A cooperative agreement is a little bit like a marriage between a grant and a contract. Cooperative agreement is still a grant by the confines of what defines grants and contracts. Cooperative agreement is still a grant, but it is a grant with some measures and some metrics that are actually applied to it. So when you work under a cooperative agreement, it's really a grant that says, we're going to make our best effort, but we are actually going to hit these things. A really great example of a cooperative agreement that HTDC and Cindy definitely know about is the FAST Award. There are FAST Awards for 47 of the states, and Puerto Rico. Well, no, Puerto Rico is not one anymore, is it? For 47 organizations, there could be one per state that helps people go after like SBIR and STTR funding. And that's a cooperative agreement. It's a grant, but they say, we're going to do these basic things. Anything we do after that, though, hey, more impact for your dollars. Now, for-profits are typically a contract vehicle when you are looking at the government as a whole. With programs like SBIR, which is the Small Business Innovation Research, or their sister program, STTR, which is Small Business Technology Transfer, you can actually work under a grant. And even if it's a grant there, you still come into the same mechanisms of really your best effort, but they want you to hit some things. So it's a much more like a cooperative agreement for some of those funding vehicles than it is just for a regular grant like a nonprofit would be able to get. And that's because business moves. So they know that for-profit businesses need to, one, serve a mission that they want to do, but two, they need to actually be, performing something for themselves. The purpose of a for-profit business is always growth. If you're a for-profit business and you go, I'm fine with where I am, you're stagnated. You're in the wrong area. There should always be a, what else can I do? How else can I actually go forward? And how else can I drive what I'm doing? But each of the programs, no matter what you're actually working under, will have very specific mechanisms for what can we budget, how can we budget, and what can you actually use your monies for. And that really is driven by the limits. Typically, whenever you're working with federal government, federal funding, you're working on a cost plus or a fixed amount. And a fixed amount is just them saying, hey, we're going to make up to this amount of award. And it could be $1 million, it could be $50,000. It's whatever they actually want, whatever they say, whatever they actually release, and what's called their, requests for applications, requests for quotes, however they're actually putting out their information. Now, the other type you can actually have is what's called a cost plus. And a cost plus essentially says, this is how much we charge to do work. You essentially give them almost something like an hourly rate, and could be a fully burdened rate, which we'll get to very shortly. Or it could be your just flat rate of this is what it cost us labor wise. And then you give them a target for, it'll take us 20,000 hours to do this, 20,000 man hours. So however many people you have working for you, if you have 5 people times an 8-hour day, that's 40 man hours a day. So man hours is just the level of effort each individual is putting in that equates to a specific number. Now, cost plus is more of a kind of that working line where it's like a not to exceed kind of thing, where they go, okay, You can actually just do your cost plus, but try to stay under this threshold. You'll often see that in the application where they say, we will make an award up to for a cost plus. And that's just their ceiling where they go, if you go over this number, we need to have a serious discussion because something is definitely going way off kilter and way off plan for what we wanted. Now, when you actually look at beyond the limits and kind of making sure that with what you're putting together is acceptable to them, there's a couple terms that you actually want to know when it comes to federal awards and budgeting for federal awards. And this is actually dependent on the different programs that they're using, whether it is more of a community building or impact building effort, whether it is a research and development opportunity like SBIR, STTR. How they make their awards and what they actually look for can impact the budget you put together. Now, if you see wording such as best price or technically acceptable, that means there is wiggle room for the amount of funding. A lot of times they will say, here is a ceiling of $1 million per award, but we're looking for best price technically acceptable. That means they want to save money. So if their ceiling is $1 million and you put together $1 million proposal, looks perfect, looks great, somebody else puts in a $950,000 proposal, hits all the metrics, guess what? They're going to win that because it's technically acceptable, but the best price. Now, if you do not see language like that, and this actually comes in a lot into things like SBIR and STTR, if you don't see language about best price or technically acceptable, that typically means that whatever they're saying is their ceiling, they want to give that money away. If they say that the ceiling is $305,000 and you come in less than $305,000, congratulations, you just lost money. They want to give the money away because they have a very specific budget they have to actually go through, and they have a very specific budget they have to burn through. Any money that you go, I can save you money, causes them more grief and headache. They don't want to save money in these cases. So if it's best price technically acceptable, they want to save money. If not, they want to give the full amount away. Now, when you're thinking about, okay, I know what I actually need to do. I know the target that I need to actually go for. How do I put together a budget? The first thing to know is there are different things called cost categories. And cost categories are, let's say they're broken down into 3 areas. We're going to focus on 2 broad terms here, direct and indirect, but certain vehicles can have a 3rd category called a fee or a profit, depending on who the awardee is. That falls outside of what a direct or an indirect rate is, though, because the fee/profit is something they just say, here's money. We know that you put this together. We know that you think it's going to take this amount of time, this amount of dollars. You need a little bit of flex dollars, though, because, and as part of my background, I did project management for a very long time. You ever talk to a project manager and they say they had no project that went off kilter, off budget, off scope? Either they had a really great team that was fixing fires in the background, or they were a terrible project manager. Every project goes off kilter. So they want to give you flex dollars. They go, we know that you're going to do your best, but projects are a dumpster fire. So here's some money to put out that fire. But that's neither here nor there. So we're going to talk about direct cost and indirect cost. Now, even within those, there will be certain items and what they'll actually call a line item. That is an allocated amount or an allocated just thing that you can actually do with the amount of money, the funding that you actually put towards it. And we're going to break down through each one of those within the next couple of slides. But the thing to know is that, particularly for things like direct costs, when you have a line item of something like labor, and you say that we need $50,000 in labor, that's great. If you come under that amount of money, hey, perfect. If you go over that amount of money, then you actually need to talk to someone. Usually you can transfer up to 10% between different line items and between different categories without actually having to have a conversation. But if it's going to be, we budgeted, and here's a real world example that I fell into. We budgeted $50,000 for contracted services. We only had $20,000 worth of contracted services. We need to figure out something to do with that extra $30,000. Took multiple chains of emails and multiple weeks to actually get authorization to move that $30,000 around. So when you put together a budget, make sure your dollars are pretty much where they want to be. Don't just go, well, I need to figure out some way to actually use up another $15,000. I'm going to dump it in this category. It can be very, very difficult to move that money. So try to be as on target as possible with your numbers when you come into federal dollars and managing federal dollars. As you will hear in our next presentation, mismanaging federal dollars is the one thing you do not want to do. You will have multiple visits from the IRS, and then you are in violation of what they call fraud, waste, and abuse, which you have to actually sign off on. I know what this is. And if you don't, it can equate to jail time. So don't mismanage federal funds. If there's nothing else you learned from this, hour or so I'm going to do, take away I'm not going to mismanage federal funds. But, costs within categories and costs within line items are generally okay to flex, where you say, okay, I'm going to put $10,000 towards this type of material. I actually need 15. I'm going to take it out of this other type of material. Within those categories, within those line items, moving money around for specific allocations is generally fine. It's just whenever you have to move money between categories and between line items. So now you're probably going, well, Del, what's a line item? Sure. Line items are very much a direct cost thing. Direct costs are costs that are directly mapped to activities that are going to take place on that project. That means that if somebody's going to take 5 hours of engineering to design a schematic, that's 5 hours of labor. That is a direct cost. It is something that someone is directly doing to achieve your scope of work, your specific opportunity project objectives. SOPO is another term that you actually might hear. Your specific just project scope, whatever you're saying we are going to do, and by the end of the funding period, we will have achieved it. That is a direct cost if it moves that mission forward or moves that target forward. So a lot of times direct costs are things that can actually say every dollar that was spent within this category did something for this project specifically. So it's things like labor, equipment. We'll get into equipment very shortly. Try not to think of equipment as one of your line items. Equipment just makes things difficult when you buy equipment with federal dollars. But things like materials, supplies, contracted services, consultants, people that are actually going to provide some sort of assistance, those are all direct costs, because everything that entity did, or everything that material, that supply, that labor person did, move the project forward. So direct costs move the project forward in some measurable and feasible manner. Now, direct costs are actually extremely restrictive. When we come across the 3 cost categories of direct, indirect, and that fee/profit, direct are the most restrictive. When you say, I'm going to spend money on this, you need to spend the money on that. Indirect costs, which we'll get to very shortly, are fairly flexible. They actually just pay for a specific grouping of things rather than a specific thing within a grouping. And realize abstract concepts are weird. We have some examples. And then if the particular vehicle that you're working under allows for that fee/profit, that is completely unrestricted. That is like the don't ask, don't tell pot of money. Here's $20,000 for your fee. Great. Here's what I'm going to use that $20,000 for. No, I don't want to know. whatever you use the $20,000 for is what you use it. So when you think of your kind of categories and what is required, just remember that direct costs have to be spent in that very specific way. Indirect costs actually pay for business operations, and anything that is a fee/profit or is a term like that is a use the money however you need. It's essentially your CYA policy for those projects that turn into dumpster fires or go off the rails, go off the tracks. It's a way for you to actually get that back on. Now, when you're actually putting together a budget, and for most opportunities, except for some very specific like procurement contracts where they may just be buying something directly from you, you're going to have to also put together a justification or a narrative for the budget. You can't just tell them, I want $20,000 to do this. And they go, all right, cool. It would be like if you hired somebody to come in and redesign your kitchen and they say $50,000. You're going to want to know, well, what's that $50,000 going to do? Like, what are we actually talking here? How much materials, what type of materials are you going to use? You're going to want to know those things. Federal government is the same exact way. So you're going to have to provide some sort of information. Now, typically when it comes to direct costs, that's either narrative where you just say what it's going to be, or it's things like quotes where you go out there and you say, I need 500 pounds of stainless steel 300 to do this. It's probably going to cost me this. Now, how much is it actually going to cost you? Go get a quote for 500 pounds of the materials and how much it costs you to actually get it in, how much it costs you to actually transfer it. They want to know that information. So whenever you're having to put together things like a budget justification or a narrative, just know that you have to actually tell them, here's how much it is, and you have to have some evidence for it. Whether the evidence is your words or whether the evidence is a quote directly from a supplier, just depends on what the item is that you're requesting. But let's run through a couple different kind of line item categories here. As I mentioned, labor is first and foremost the biggest line item. Generally, for pretty much every federal award you would ever have as a business, labor is the top line item. And because it's also pretty much going to be the top dollar driver, unless it's a very specific, I want to buy something from you in a procurement, the labor is always going to be the most expensive because labor is people hours, labor is effort, and effort costs money. So when you think about labor, it's actually about kind of the work that needs to get done, the people that are actually going to do the work. And a lot of times it'll be split into what's called senior or key persons and other personnel. Senior or key persons is a specific individual. It's somebody you go, I need Dell on this project because Dell has experience doing this. Dell has expertise in this area. Dell has done these activities in the past. That means he is the best pick here. Other personnel are positions. If you want to be reductive, you just say other personnel are warm bodies, but other personnel are just positions. You say, I need mechanical engineers. And they say, well, who are your mechanical engineers? I just need mechanical engineers. It's people that can do a specific job, but people that don't have very specific experience. It would be the difference between if you're launching a new satellite and you need somebody that has actually done cold welding for, carbon fiber materials that can, withstand 40 G's worth of pressure. I ain't an engineer or scientist, so I probably just gave y'all science that is entirely made up. I'm a business dude, roll with the punches here. But if it's somebody that has that very specific background, they are senior or key persons. If it's somebody that just knows how to do cold welding, well, that's an other personnel because it's something that they should have been trained on. And so with senior key persons, they're always named individuals. Other personnel are just named titles or, job categories. And there's always going to be some sort of calculation that you have to do, no matter what the opportunity is. They want to know, okay, a base rate, a number of hours, and if you have any modifiers on there, like, fringe, which is an indirect cost we will get to shortly. But you have to actually just give them that information. So this actually comes up as part of that budget justification where you tell them, we need 400 hours from this person. Here's what that 400 hours would look like. Now, materials and supplies is probably the second largest category, typically when it actually comes into a budget, because after you pay for people, well, they need to do something. And so a lot of times that they need to do something is they need to tinker with stuff. There's a material, there's a supply, there's something that will actually be utilized and used up. And the utilized and used up is a very important discriminator here, because for it to be a material or supply, it has to be dedicated to the project and it has to be, quote unquote, burned through during the operations. So it's something that you can't actually just like pull away. A laptop is not a material or a supply, because a laptop, once that project's over, well, guess what? You unplug it, you take it away. If it's 500 pounds of carbon, fiber that you've actually melted down and welded to something, hell of a lot harder to pick that up once the project is over. So that would be the utilized and used up, is it went through some sort of change process that you just can't easily unbolt it and take it away. And sometimes things even like subscriptions can actually go into materials and supplies, because generally when you're utilizing even a subscription, yes, it's not something that's used up, but it's something that's dedicated towards that and dedicated actually towards the work. So materials and supplies are a pretty open category when it comes to budgets and as far as direct costs come into play. With materials and supplies, typically you don't have to give like an exhaustive punch list of, we need 40 8-inch hex bolts with a star fastener on them. You just need $600 worth of fasteners. So anything that's less than like $5,000 for a particular unit, not for a particular batch. Like if you need $10,000 worth of fasteners, awesome. But if one of those fasteners is some gigantic bolt that's going to cost you $5,001, well, then it's not a material or supply. It has to be under $5,000 for each individual unit, not a grouping, not a bulk purchase, but for each individual thing. Now, equipment is something that a lot of people's eyes instantly start to sparkle when they say that I can buy equipment with government funds. Equipment is one of the most restrictive categories ever when it actually comes into budgeting and when it actually comes into thinking about, am I going to buy this, and thinking about what it does for your budget. If you can get away with not buying equipment with federal funds, do it. If you could actually lease something rather than buy it, lease the equipment. As soon as you go to purchase equipment with federal dollars, your life changes for the next typically 10 to 15 years, because you do not own that piece of equipment until the full depreciation value has been reached. Anybody that actually runs a business knows that depreciation value is generally a 10-year timeline. So you are holding on to a piece of federal property for 10 years, paying for that piece of federal property for 10 years, paying for the upkeep and maintenance on that piece of federal property for 10 years. And 9.5 years down the road, the federal government, the likelihood of this happening, probably low, but they do have the option to come in and say, you know what, we need that back. Awesome. So don't buy equipment with federal funding. If you do have to buy equipment, it has to be dedicated entirely to that project. It cannot be anything that could potentially be dual used. So a lot of people go, well, I'm going to buy a laptop. How can you guarantee that laptop is only going to be utilized for this very specific project, for the very specific direct activities on that project? I'm going to buy a PC. I'm going to buy these things. Unless it is something that you're actually physically bolting on to like a gigantic piece of hardware that is going to drive it in some fashion, it's always very tough to make that argumentation to the government that this is not dual use. This is going to be specifically utilized for this project, specifically utilized in these ways, in this fashion. Nothing else can actually happen with it. So while equipment is a line item that many opportunities have, 90% of the time you do not want to use this line item. If they allow it, more power to you. Just know that what you're getting into when you buy pieces of equipment with federal funding. Another line item that actually category that comes up with a lot of people is things like, I'm going to go ahead and group the next two slides together because the next slide after this should be consultants, but subawards and consultants. With each project you do, you don't have to do everything yourself. There is no guidance that says, we're going to give you $1 million. You have to do everything yourself. You cannot bring in anybody from the outside. If you don't have that capability, too bad. We want part of the money back. A lot of people will actually use subawards, consultants, things like contracted services to do something that is outside of their capabilities. Maybe it's outside of your technical expertise. Maybe it gives you access to things like facilities or equipment that you don't want to purchase. Maybe there's something that, you bring in things like interns to actually do work that you would actually transfer into workforce development efforts for your business. You can bring in outside organizations and outsiders. Now, there's a reason why I said outsiders and outside organizations, because dependent on what they're doing and dependent on who they are, they could either be a consultant or a subaward. Subawards are to organizations. So someone like University of Hawaii at Manila, UH Manila, they could be a subaward because they are an organization that is coming in, devoting facilities, devoting time, devoting resources to help you achieve your project goals, your project mission, the scope of work that you outlined, whatever you said that we're going to do, but we need a little outside help. If it's an organization, it's a subaward. And that's actually really important because organizations are held to a much more strict, just kind of rule guidance and rule policy. So when you have things like subawards, which is an organization, a lot of times they have to actually have their own budget, which will look very similar to yours, just for a much modified amount of, we're giving you $30,000. They have to go through all of those same categories. They have to actually put in all of those different line items. They're actually charging that money and saying where that money is going to be utilized, how it's going to be utilized. So a lot of times they need things like letters of commitment that say, we as an organization are aware of what's happening. We're aware of what we are agreeing to do. We're aware of the money. We're aware of the project. A letter of commitment essentially says, we know what we're getting into. Whoever it is at the organization that can sign them into a contract, duly state and, hereby as my signature bears, whatever weird legalese you want to put in there. Now, consultants are individuals. A consultant is an outside person. Even if they are an organization and run a consulting organization, if it is through their organization, like there is a difference between Mackey and Peak Innovations Group. Peak Innovations Group is my company. You're hiring my company. My company puts the full effort behind the work. Even though it's a company of one, I am Peak Innovations Group. If it is Peak, it is a subaward. If it's Dell just as a dude outside of his normal operations of his business, it's a consultant. And consultants just give you a dollar amount. They go, yeah, I'll give you 500 hours at my, normal rate of $165 an hour, whatever that is. So that's the big differentiation when it comes to bringing in outsiders. Is a subaward is an organization that has their own budget, has their own drivers, brings more to bear than a specific person to a project. A specific person is a consultant. And the reason it's important to kind of understand this differentiation is it starts to break down into, well, how much work do I need from the outside? If you're bidding a project and 80% of the work is going to come from outside entities and 80% of the budget is going to go to those outside entities, whether it's an organization or whether it's an individual, why are you the awardee? So whenever you're thinking of that and looking at projects, also know that you're going to deal with some maximums, whether it is SBIR and STTR deal with it very specifically. Other opportunities deal with it in a more squishy fashion where they won't tell you, okay, you can only have, 50% of this, but you will actually a lot of times find guiding language where the primary involvement has to, the majority involvement has to. Typically, primary and majority in government speak is 51%. Doesn't really need to be over that, but just know that if you are not going to do at least 51% of the work and receive 51% of the money, you are probably not the prime applicant when it comes to things like federal awards. So as you start to look at what am I actually going to do for this project, and as you start to total up those things like your direct costs, your labor, your materials and supplies, everything else, if it comes out to 40% of the budget, you're a subaward. Just kind of plain bar none. So keep that in mind as you're looking at projects and thinking about, do I have the wherewithal to actually do this? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't find somebody else to prime it and you be a sub. That happens quite often where you go, we could do a lot of this, we just can't do everything or we can't do a majority. I want somebody else to step in. I will sub to you, I'll help you, but they're going to be the primary awardee in that case. So again, consultants, individuals, they do something specific. And a lot of times that will actually happen when you're working with something like a faculty researcher or a professor, and they say, I'm going to give you hours. I'm going to work not as my university, but I'm going to take time out of my day. If they're taking time out of their day, they're not a consultant. A consultant happens within your own time and your own hours. So it has to be outside of that normal 8 hours of operation. If it happens during their 9 to 5, that's a subaward because they're taking money away from the organization they work for. So kind of also be aware of that, is that a lot of times when you're looking at the difference between a sub and a consultant, depends on when stuff happens, depends on how it happens. It's not up to you to actually control that, though. If you're working with a professor that's like, hey, I'm going to work on the down low, hey, that's on them. If they want to get fired over that, more power to them. But just kind of know that differentiation. Now, the other kind of area that you run into that it kind of breaks what we just talked about for subawards is called contracted services. This happens a lot in research and development type activities where you don't have a subaward with an organization because it's something that they are actually set up specifically to do. If you go to UH Manila to help you figure out some technical aspect of your idea, your innovation, whatever you're pushing forward for getting a federal award, they'll put together a scope of work. They'll say, okay, well, we're going to do this. We're going to help you do this because they're an education institution. Their primary mission is to educate. However, you have things that are called like CORs, which are contracted service offices that say, we do testing. That's all we do. We do genetic testing for, this many samples for this. and you go, I need genetic testing. And they go, great. It's going to cost you $400 because that's how much we charge. That's a contracted service. Contracted services actually fall outside of the limits when it comes to, I'm going to work with an outsider. So if it's a contracted service, which essentially you just go to a website, you say, I need to order, 200 tests. How much is this going to charge or cost me? And they say $50,000. That's a contracted service. That is totally outside the bounds of what is normally considered outside services, such as a consultant and a sub-award. So keep that in mind, is you can actually work with outsiders if it's something that they just normally do within their own business operations and don't have to specifically set aside time to. A better way to look at this is if they are materially moving the idea forward through their ideas or the application of their ideas, anything that would share a little bit of maybe intellectual property, which is a workshop we're going to have next Tuesday. But anything like that, as long as it's not actually moving that forward and moving the IP forward, it would be a contracted service because it's something they just go, give us money, we'll give you X in return. Yep. And then the last one that you typically have under direct cost is just a catch-all category called other direct costs. It's always good to inform people about this, but other direct cost is extremely dependent on the particular opportunity, the particular vehicle, the particular program it's under, the particular agency. Other direct costs can be anything from outside of labor, anything else is another direct cost, to if it doesn't fit within these 13 different categories, it's an other direct cost. So just as a heads up, nothing more. Sometimes you'll actually run into an other direct cost category. It's essentially if it doesn't fit into these, what we call line items, such as labor, materials and supplies, etc., it's an other direct cost. Lost my mouse. There it goes again. Now, the other main category that we're going to talk about here is called indirect cost. Now, direct costs directly get a job done. They are mapped to specific activities that are undertaken with the work. Indirect costs support the work. And you go, well, what do you mean support the work? That's literally it. Indirect costs can be a lot of different things. Indirect costs can be facility rentals. Indirect costs can be your utilities. Indirect costs can be paying a admin assistant to help you go through emails or answer the phones while you're neck deep with a pocket protector and the Bunsen burner trying to split the atom or whatever technical work you're doing. Indirect costs are the things that support the project that are not directly mappable to the project itself. So you're putting together a project and you go, well, we're going to need 500 hours to actually do this engineering test. Okay, that's a direct cost. Well, we need someone to come in and turn on the computers and to actually, every now and then go in there and make sure that our engineers aren't asleep, or to help, go in and jiggle the mouse when it's a 300 or a 30-hour, compute so that the computer doesn't shut down. Well, that's not directly mappable. That's an indirect cost. It supports the thing happening and supports the thing getting done. Now, within indirect costs, you have a couple of different ways that it's actually broken down. And indirect cost is very squishy on how deep do you need to go. Because indirect costs just support the business, it's kind of a Sophie's choice. Do you want to break it down into things like what's called fringe, overhead, G&A, or do you just want to have an indirect rate? So it depends on how complex your operation is. It depends on the, quote unquote, color of money that you're using. For things like SBIR and STTR, typically you'll just have an indirect rate. You won't have to worry about, okay, well, I need 15% fringe because fringe are employee support cost and I need to pay for health insurance. Or it won't be, well, I need to pay for my utilities, which if the utilities that don't drive the project go into G&A, but the utilities that do drive the project go into overhead, you can have just an indirect rate. And it can actually be a combination of all of those things that are just supporting items. Once you get into, well, we're $100 million company and we, have 1,000 employees across 3 geographical time zones. Yeah, you're probably going to need that differentiation between overhead, G&A, fringe, other indirect drivers that you can have. But just to start off with, indirect cost is a supporting cost. And you can actually be very restrictive in what you can take for indirect costs, dependent on the opportunity that you're going after. 40% is generally a typically good rate for a small startup that has probably 3 to 5 employees, probably been in business for 5 years or less. Once you start adding more people, once you start adding more work, well, then it gets higher. When you do something like work with a DOE funded lab like Sandia, you're looking at about a 95% indirect rate because they have to actually account for a lot more costs that help them support the business than just you operating. So as you get started and as you actually transition into doing more awards, doing more work, you always want to go for the highest number possible and then kind of flex. Because if you start off with a really low number, until someone comes in and actually audits you and say, yeah, that's actually what your indirect rate is, you can get stuck at that lower number. And that's very important when you know about some of these different calculations. A lot of federal agencies will have what they call a de minimis rate. And a de minimis rate is, you don't have to justify it to us. We'll allow you to actually take this rate. NIH operates under a 40% de minimis rate. If you've never been federally audited for your indirect, which an organization will come in and say, let me see your books, let me see your operations, let me see the paperwork that actually supports it, let me see your policies. It is a intensive, generally about 2-week process if it goes well. If it doesn't go well, it's about a 2-month process. So if you've never actually gone through that, you have to take what's called the de minimis rate, unless you can justify stuff. Now, if you're working with a very highly scientific organization like NSF or NIH, the de minimis rate is fine. 40 to 50%, that'll actually get you there. If you're working with a more, let's say, blue collar type organization like USDA, who has a 10% de minimis rate, 10% ain't going to do much for you. In fact, the reason I can actually say that is generally costs you about 18% in payroll taxes to pay for unemployment, to pay for modified healthcare costs per employee. You're losing 8% if you take the de minimis rate. So kind of know that from the opportunity you're going after. If they have a de minimis rate that is less than 40%, try to justify, because you're allowed to actually give them a rate and to give them a factor of, we calculated our rate at this. It's up to them on whether they accept it or not, and up to them on whether they go, okay, you told us 40%, we'll actually go with that. You told us 67%, you need some backing up here. So if it is a super low de minimis rate, give them your own rate, but don't shoot for the moon and go, I want 105%, indirect rate. Unless you employ over 1,000 people and work, multinationally, you ain't going to have 105% indirect rate. So be realistic. Because at the end of the day, being realistic with your numbers is what developing a federal budget is about. That is the bare minimum, bare bones of what they look at. Is this reasonable? Is this realistic?
Do I agree that it's going to take $100,000 worth of materials? Or is this person out to lunch and they are trying to take money away from us? As long as you can justify it, as long as it's reasonable, the government wants to work with you because they just want things to happen. They just want a job to get done. They don't care how it has to get done. Just be reasonable and make sure that things are fairly in tune with reality. So I'm going to leave a couple minutes just for some questions here, but just real quick, this is kind of what this actually looks like. This would be a table that you would put together, and this is how you would actually input it into something like grants.gov, where you have the different categories, you show how you got to those, and you show what your overall is. Right now, I'm as well as doing this, also teaching a USDA accelerator for everybody. That is actually out of line because it's 179,000, can't be over 175,000. So I need to change something there. But this is literally what a budget looks like for a USDA SBIR phase 1. There are your different categories. Here's how you would arrive to that. And here's actually the level of information that you have to put in. Aside from, I just figged some stuff where I said item A. You can't say item A. It has to be like fasteners or whatever. You have to provide a brief description. But this is what a federal budget looks like. And people go, well, it's really hard to put one of these together. There's all these different things that you have to put in. Not really. There's a lot of backbone you have to do, and there's a lot of figuring out that you have to do. But when you actually put numbers into the spreadsheets for these systems, you're talking about 5 minutes maybe. So don't let stuff like this kind of worry you. And don't go, this seems so complex. I can't do it by myself. There's no opportunity here for me. If you can balance your checkbook, you can put together a federal budget for an award. You can put together a federal budget for an award of $179,272.75. That's how easy it is. So don't get overwhelmed. Don't get stressed. There's lots of abilities and lots of people out there that actually want to help you. We're running out of time here, but just a couple of common mistakes that people often run into when it comes to federal budgets. Biggest mistake is probably the mismatch on the cost versus the intent. The government doesn't want to just give you money to make anything happen. They want to give you money to make specific things happen. One of the biggest mistakes people do is they go, okay, I want to do this thing, but this opportunity is actually for this instead. I'm still going to go after it. So if it is a development and you're not doing any development, if it is a labor heavy opportunity and you have nothing in there but materials and supplies, that's going to be the biggest way that you can actually fail in putting together your budget, is if the numbers that you actually put together in the line items and the different categories don't match this is the work that's actually intended to come out of this. Another thing that a lot of people do is they will request what's called unallowables. There are very specific things that are unallowable to use for federal funding. These are very much guided by the different programs, so I can't give you a punch list, but just know that it will actually tell you that specific things are an unallowable cost. If you try to sneak that cost in, they will see it, they will find it, they will identify it, and you will be rejected. So if they don't allow you to pay for things like patenting costs, and you say, I'm going to file a PCT application, that will be rejected. Now, doesn't mean that you can't pay someone to actually help you figure out a strategy. That can actually happen. Sometimes that's an allowable cost, but paying an actual patent fee is not. So know that unallowables are for very specific activities and very specific things. You can skirt the line with unallowables, but you can't cross the line with unallowables. And I would say the biggest other common mistake that actually happens, is a lot of people reduce the allowances that they'll give just to do work. I just mentioned those de minimis rates with things like indirect costs, with like NIH giving you 40%, and you go, I'm going to only take 20% because I want to do more work. That's the easiest way that you can start to kill your business day one. They give you these allowances because they know that people need those allowances. And it can actually reflect badly on you as a business and as an organization. If you reduce those, you will have certain reviewers and people like me that see that, okay, well, Cindy is cutting her indirect rate down to 10% just to do work. Cindy's not ready to be a business. Cindy doesn't have a business in mind. Cindy doesn't have business operations and goals in mind, because things like that indirect allowance pay for you to actually start to scale your business, start to grow your business, start to put the metrics in place for your business to succeed. So don't cut those things like your indirect rates, your fee/profit categories they give you, cost allowances they give you just because you go, I want to squeak out a little bit more work. That's called robbing Peter to pay Paul. Biggest mistake you're ever going to make as a business, because you will be in that statistic of, what's the latest? 76% of small businesses fail within the first 5 years. You will be in that category and in that statistic. So don't decrease these allowances just to get some extra work done. So a couple final thoughts here before we transition, even though we started late by about 10 minutes, want to get us back on track. So we will have opportunity to have one-on-ones with myself, our other presenters later on. So if you do have questions, snap one of those one-on-ones. If you are watching this virtually and you have questions, Cindy, can you drop my email address into the chat there? If you have questions and you're with us virtually, I know that you don't have a one-on-one, but send me an email. Be happy to answer questions. But just a real quick kind of summary here. Navigating budgets can be complex and tricky, but it can also be extremely easy. Just know that figure out your categories, figure out your drivers, figure out your costs. Putting together a budget is a lot more pre-work than it is actually work itself. It's like if you ever have put together a really great Excel spreadsheet. You have to do a lot of work in getting the formulas in there and making, all the cells line up. But once they do, updating it takes you seconds. That's what a federal budget should be like. You do a lot of background work, and then it's very easy to take those calculations and take those numbers to new opportunities every single time. Don't overpromise and underdeliver. The government doesn't like that. You will kind of get a black mark and you will get known. Sure, a lot of these you can actually fail, particularly as a grant, since it is best effort. But if you just start failing left and right, because you said that we're going to do these things and it's just theoretically not possible, you will get a black mark. You will keep from getting funded in the future. So keep that in mind, is that you do need to be pretty on top with your numbers. But at the end of the day, actually getting the work done is what matters. If the numbers go a little bit over, if the numbers are a little bit off kilter, typically they're not going to come hunt you down and hound you for, hey, you spent 2 cents more than you should have. We want that 2 cents back. Not a John Cusack movie. But they just want the work to get done. They don't care as long as it's not literal fraud, waste, and abuse. We actually charged you $1 million when we should have charged you $100,000. They will come after you then. But otherwise, just get the work done. And just kind of to go along with that, ensure you are being really forthright with your charging and your allowances, and actually calculating things, knowing where money's coming out of, knowing where money has to actually go into. I'm sure we're about to do a presentation about that. And knowing, your kind of finances and how to actually, factor those things in. And lastly, just take any and all allowances available. Again, that kind of one of those final slides I have, don't cut allowances just to do work. Take what they're actually giving you because they want to give you, they want the flex, they know that stuff can actually go wrong. But we are going to transition now into our next presentation.